Thank you, Denise, and hello, everyone. If everybody, the chat's open, so feel free to use the chat during the session. You can put comments, you can put questions, and you can say hello, say where you are, so that we can all find out where we're all from. Okay, brilliant. Ireland and Mexico City. Amazing. Right, I'm going to just screen share because I think it's more interesting for you to see my screen than me throughout the whole thing. So my name is Caroline Hickman. I'm a lecturer at the University of Bath in the UK, and I lecture in social work, but also climate psychology. And my research for the past 10 years or more has been specifically looking at how children and young people emotionally are engaging with the climate and biological crisis. But a lot of my psychotherapy practice, so alongside this, I'm a clinical psychotherapist. And as a clinical psychotherapist, I work with adults, I work with couples, I work with families. I do a lot of work with young people, with youth activists and young groups of young people in schools, talking with them about how to navigate the psychological impact of the climate crisis. There's been a lot of emphasis up until now on the physical health impacts of the climate emergency. In fact, most of the attention has been given to the physical impact. But the latest IPCC report this year started finally to talk about the psychological impact, the mental health impact. About time. I still think this is an emergent mental health issue, by which I mean we have got an increased understanding of this, but I think if anybody thinks they've got a complete, perfect understanding of the psychological impact of this, then I wouldn't listen to them, because I've been researching and studying this for nearly 20 years, and I'm still wrapping my head around it. I'm still discovering things all the time. So I think we need that humility and understanding to help us understand this, because it is new, it is emergent. So what do I mean by that? For example, okay, humanity has faced all sorts of adversity and hardship for millennia, forever. But we've never faced anything on this scale before. So let's take a different example. Let's take something like the Cuban Missiles Crisis, or a world war, or a tsunami, or the global pandemic, the COVID pandemic. Humanity has faced things like this, but they've not been worldwide, number one. So if there's a world war, there's parts of the world that are unaffected. We also have a narrative around things like COVID, which say, when we get over this, when we get beyond it, when we get on the other side of it, then we can rebuild, then we can go back to normal. The problem we've got, and bear with me, because the beginning of the talk will be a bit uncomfortable, but I promise not to leave you in that state. The problem with the climate crisis is we're not at the start of the crisis. We're halfway through the crisis now. We're not at the beginning. We're halfway. So that means even if we went to zero carbon emissions tomorrow, which we're not going to manage to do, the amount of carbon already in the atmosphere will continue to cause heat to rise. It will continue to cause sea levels to rise. It will continue to cause worsening, more frequent storms. That is already started. That is not going to stop now. So we have to recognize emotionally, psychologically, that we're halfway through this story. It's not too late to change the end of the story. But it is too late to think, oh, well, we'll deal with this in the future, because the future started happening a long time ago. If you live in Nigeria, Bangladesh, India, the Philippines, and certain parts of the US, the future has been here for a long time. Depending on the country that you're living in, there's often still a framing of this as, well, we've still got time to deal with this later on. So we can't use either of those psychological frames. We can't think, oh, well, we've got resilience. We also can't say technology will fix this. We haven't got enough technology developed quickly enough, although we have got technology which will help, but we are failing to invest in that technology. We're continuing to bury our heads in the sand about the scale of the problem. So there's a huge risk here globally that what we're doing is kind of dealing with things that are relatable in regard to our own country or our own community, and not recognizing the global scale of this. Nothing will get resolved unless we look at this systemically and globally. So this is uncomfortable, this is painful. And this causes anxiety, it causes distress, it causes anger, it causes frustration. These are all psychologically enormously healthy responses. So let's also be really clear about this at the start. If you're feeling distress or anxiety or anger, frustration, depression, this is an emotionally, mentally healthy response. We measure mental health by looking at people's capacity to respond to external reality. And our external reality tells us things are getting worse, things are severely changing, and we need to take action now. This is what Greta Thunberg has been saying, and other Fridays for Future activists for a long, long time. I want you to panic. I want you to act like your house is on fire, because we have that need for that urgency. Equally, psychologically, we have to be cautious, because there's a lot of people kind of worry about that panic and very worried about either paralyzing and overwhelming people or causing them to shut down or react against it. Yeah, it's a really tough thing to navigate, but to find a way through this. Ironically, there's a binary split here where we split into either or thinking, and we can go into apocalyptic doom and gloom. It's all hopeless, it's all useless. What's the point? Ironically, at the other end of the scale, it's all on a spectrum. At the other end of the scale is this belief that everything will be okay. The government will save us. Technology will save us. We've got plenty of time to deal with this. Do you see what I'm saying? We've got these two opposite positions here. Neither of these are true. What these are is it's our emotional, psychological, intellectual ego trying to regain control. Because if we decide it's all over, it's pointless, weirdly, we're back in control. Or if we decide someone else will fix this, we're back in control. We're not feeling uncertainty, we're not feeling vulnerability, and we're not feeling the chaos that comes from standing in the middle, which is where we need to stand. Where we need to stand against those powerful opposing emotional forces is right here in the middle. There is massive uncertainty and insecurity and vulnerability, and there is a lot we can do. So we have to move from this either or thinking to both and. It is both awful and serious, and we need to face the reality of this, and there is a lot we can do. And that is a more of a radical hope position. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I just wanted to frame this at the very, very start. So any eco-anxiety or distress in relation to what's going on is a psychologically healthy response. I would worry about people that were not feeling these sorts of feelings, preferably not all on the same day, right? But we move between these feelings. I'd worry about people that weren't having emotional responses. I'd think, what are you doing with your emotions, with your feelings around this? Are you just completely burying them? Or are you in massive denial about the scale of this and how daunting it is? So the other thing I say is, well, if you're feeling anxiety or distress or depression, well, you're only feeling that because you care. And if you didn't care, you wouldn't be feeling it, right? And I want us to be proud of caring. I want you to be proud that you care. I want you to be proud that you have this empathy, this anxiety, this care for the rest of the world. Sally Weintraub has written a beautiful book called The Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis. She talks about how the world has developed this culture of uncare because of neoliberal exceptionalism, almost as if it's now shameful or embarrassing to care. Well, what we need is a lot more care. Otherwise, we are not going to navigate our way through this. No one country can sort of retreat behind walls or fences or other forms of barrier. And we see it happening in the world all over the place. No one country will be okay unless we're all okay. So I'm going to continue exploring this psychological framing of the climate emergency. Feel free to put comments and thoughts in the chat. And stick with this, because although this can be unsettling and disturbing emotionally, this is also what we need to feel in order to build the emotional intelligence and emotional resilience that we need to navigate this. So there is a journey here between this anxiety and empathy and community eco-aliveness. So I'm sure you're very familiar with this kind of framing. I promise you, I'm not knocking COVID. I'm not making COVID small at all. It is a global threat, continues to be a global threat. Probably technically the COVID wave should be placed in the biodiversity collapse wave, because COVID and other pandemics like Zika, MERS, SARS, HIV are with humanity because of biodiversity collapse and because we've broken down those relationships between ourselves and the wild other. But what this diagram shows you, what this drawing shows you, is the kind of the progressive scale of the threat. During COVID, during lockdown, a lot of young people were increasingly distressed. And I know I generalize a little here, but bear with me. They were really, really angry and upset. And they kept saying to me, well, the world can respond to COVID this quickly. Why can we not take action on the climate crisis? So that distress is being felt as a logical, progressive, meaningful distress. I don't want to take climate anxiety away from people. I want to support people in learning to navigate it and turn it into different forms of action. But I want to also increase it in people who are in denial, and particularly government ministers and oil company executives, because if they were feeling more distress and anxiety, they would probably have to behave differently. Paul Hoggett was one of the founders of the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is an open access website, which you're all welcome to go and rummage around. Loads of resources. There's a North American group, there's an Australian group, there's a UK group. They're all open. He says we are living in this time when tragedy, which is without precedent, is unfolding in front of our eyes, witnessing catastrophic rates of species extinction, biodiversity loss, soil and ocean exhaustion, runaway climate change. Something really important in here, which is the fact that we're living in it, and it's without precedent, which we've already talked about, and it's unfolding. So we don't really notice. I'm staying half the week at my mother's house at the moment, which is where I am now, and then I go home to my house the other half of the week. And my neighbour's got a new puppy. Every time I go home, every week I say, "Oh my gosh, she's grown. Oh my God, she's bigger than she was last week," because I can see that difference, because I've got that space. A few days is all it takes, and I can see the change in her. They don't notice the change in her because they're living with her day in, day out. This is one of the difficulties we've got about recognizing the impact of climate change, because it's happening subtly around us all the time. We need to open our eyes to that scale of change as it unfolds. And we need to keep in mind, and this is why you're here, and this is why I'm here, this is why Denise is here. These are core human needs. This is why we form community. This is why we pull together around these things. These are core human needs: to be seen, to be heard, to make sense, to understand. And then we're not alone. So yes, I work with people individually as a psychotherapist around climate anxiety, yeah. But I also encourage people to form community, to join groups, to join with neighbors, to tackle things within families, because you will have distress in relation to this. And what frequently causes even more distress is the fact that the people around you don't understand. So I've come to argue that climate anxiety has got relatively little to do with environmental problems. Of course, that's what triggers it. Of course, that's what upsets us to begin with. But then, as we express that despair and that distress and that anger and frustration and wanting to do something, it's when the people around you say things like, "Oh, Don't be silly. It's not that bad. Or my favorite, if it was that bad, the government would do something about it. Or if you're a child, go back to school, right? Or certain people are told, oh, well, actually, you're worried about something else. It's not really about climate change. Worry about, now, I'm not disputing the fact that, the world has other worries and other concerns. We all have to worry about rising costs of living, about fuel, about putting food on the table for our families, maybe health problems. There's all sorts of difficulties. There's racism, homophobia. There are multiple pressures on us as human beings. But the climate crisis, I believe everybody on the planet is anxious about it. But that anxiety might go under the surface. It might go out of sight. And that can leave you alone with your anxiety, alone with your distress. That causes a relational distress. So you've then got double. You've got the anxiety about what's happening to climate. Maybe you've got anxiety about what's happening to animals, to the planet that you love. And alongside that, you might be surrounded by people who don't get it. If you're surrounded by people who don't get it, you will be doubly, triply distressed. So I think I've explained this, psychology. Why climate psychology? Because of course we need practical technological innovation. Of course we need economic solutions, political solutions. But why psychology? Because we're facing the unknown. And we defend against things that are either unbearable or too big to comprehend. Humans have never faced something on this scale. So we struggle when we try to think about it. Timothy Morton describes the climate crisis as a hyperobject. What he means by that is you kind of look over there and you think, okay, we need to think about plastics. And then you look over there and you think, oh, yeah, but what about rising sea levels? And then you think, yeah, but we've got to deal with heat and we've got to deal with pollution, air pollution, and so on and so on and so on. It's multifaceted, systemic injustice that has to be tackled throughout the planet. And this is planetary concern. It's not enough to just work with people because we are indivisible from survival of the planet. And the split from nature, the split from the world, the split from the planet means that we don't know how to feel alongside this distress. We're coming from decades of believing that human development, human growth, human ego is massively superior and can technology our way out of everything. And this is wrong. And this is what's got us into this mess in the first place. It's got us into this mess in terms of psychologically, the way we treat mental health problems as though they were physical health problems. We'll just fix them, get rid of them. Remember a minute ago, I went, I don't want to get rid of your anxiety or your depression. I want you to support you so that you can make use of it, but it's meaningful. Why would you want to get rid of it? Yeah, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not crazy. You should feel this way, right? But humanity has evolved to this point of saying we shouldn't feel these things. And that's wrong. So that Western medical model that we have exported around the world to the point where people don't even realize they're living in a medical model. Not everyone around the world thinks that way. And that's one of the paradigm shifts that's needed in this. And this is the psychological framing that we're talking about. So, we like to think we're wholly conscious creatures, but we're really not. So I'm using a psychological model which includes 90-95% unconscious functioning. If we didn't have unconscious functioning, if we were purely conscious creatures in control and could choose everything, we would not choose war. We would not choose child abuse. We would not choose poverty or starvation. We would not choose these things. It's not logical. And there is mad rationalization against this. But you know when you're hearing those arguments that they do not make sense. There's unconscious pressures coming through which threaten people and burst through into consciousness in distorted ways. One of the ways to deal with the anxiety and the distress around the climate crisis is to recognize that I think Everyone is frightened, but they may deny it. They may suppress it. They may push it away. They may use defenses like disavowal, where they say, well, yeah, it's really frightening, but, I'm so happy COVID is over because I want to take 3 trips this year. And you think, well, how can those two things join up in the same mind, right? Yeah, they don't, do they? It's another form of denial. Gus Speth used to be US advisor on climate change. He said, I used to think top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And with 30 years of good science, we can deal with that. Well, he was right in that respect, but he was wrong in another respect, because what he said he realized was actually the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And that's not the job of science. So I think I've covered all of this already. Just worth saying again, that capacity to be in touch with external reality is a sign of mental health. So anyone not being able to connect with what's happening in the world and how it makes you feel, we could argue are not consciously mentally healthy. Emotionally, I've already referenced some of this whole range of emotion, anxiety, grief and solastalgia, which is a sense of grief and loss over a part of the world that you love, hope and hopelessness. It's okay to feel both, yeah? Frequently what we do is we have moments of hope and then we have hopelessness and then hope again. We'll move between these. Anger, blame, frustration, guilt and shame. Healthy responses, sadness and grief at what we've done, what we've lost. Fantasies of rescue and apocalyptic fantasies. You note I use the word fantasy here. We will imagine ourselves into different futures. It's okay to have fantasies of rescue, so long as you then follow it with, yeah, but actually it's on us. It's us that needs to take this action. These defenses are human. Avoidance, denial, delay, disavow. Again, don't judge them. Allow all these feelings, but learn to differentiate. This is a psychologically mature response, and this is a defense. Nihilism and despair. There are times where it can all get so overwhelming and we shut down emotionally. And that's not because you're not feeling anything, it's because you're feeling too much and are just being overwhelmed and flooded with emotion. So if you're having that space, to be honest, I said this to somebody this morning who said this. She said she's not feeling very much right now. She was. I said, maybe you need a break. That's okay. Take a break. Take a break from these powerful feelings. I'm framing this as well as activism is crucial, absolutely. But this is not just external activism, this is internal activism. So I said to this young woman this morning, I said, reflect on how you're feeling and how you're thinking for a few days. This is still activism. You're not disengaging from what's going on. This is another form of activism. Take a break from going out there and doing things. We need to have that flexibility to be able to move between these, because what we want is to be sustainable activists. Yeah, this is not a sprint. This is a long haul. So we don't all feel this absolutely equally, and I've been trying to scale this. Some people have a shocking awakening and go from relatively unaware to really awake all in one go, which can lead to a bit of a psychological crisis, a lot of crying, a lot of fear before you kind of get your feet back under you. Often though, people kind of wake up in a more mild, gradual way. If there's a massive crisis, well, it can lead to a breakdown of existing beliefs. If you've believed that technology is it, and then suddenly you wake up to the fact that technology is part of the problem, then what that leads to is a breakdown in trust of other people. Trust of others is crucial throughout all of this. So I've been trying to differentiate from mild feelings of eco-anxiety, where your feelings of upset are transient, they come and go. But crucially, you can be reassured. People say, it's okay, and there's this focus on optimism and hope. People say, it's okay, look, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. It reassures you. That as your anxiety gets more severe. I don't want to call it worse because that judges it as better or worse, good or bad. I don't want that kind of binary judgment around this. As it gets more medium and significant, what happens with that is your distress is harder to deal with. You feel more guilt and shame, and you lose trust in others' ability to take action. This is where it starts to often have big impact on your relationships, particularly in families and couples where one person is more distressed and the other person isn't. At the most severe critical end, people can feel suicidal, they can self-harm, there can be intrusive thoughts, difficulty sleeping, no respite, no rest, an anticipation of human extinction, an anticipation of social collapse, and an absolute breakdown in belief in others' ability to care, to the extent that you may not be able to function. This is severe. You don't need a psychotherapist for the mild, medium end of things. You do, when people get to the more severe critical end, people need to be supported quickly. And if they may need professional support from a mental health professional, it doesn't have to be. So long as somebody's not panicking around this and simultaneously saying, what you're saying makes sense. And I don't want you to act on these distressing suicidal thoughts. It's okay to have the thoughts. It's okay to have the feelings. Do differentiate. Do not act on them. That's the difference. Some of the worst that I'm seeing is dreams and nightmares, because, you know, when you go to bed at night, you want to sleep, you want to rest. Huge apologies if anybody has trouble sleeping. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible experience to be constantly tired. But when dreams are intruded on with fears about climate breakdown or social breakdown, then you get no respite. There is no break. And people are having dreams of having to kill family relatives to save them from starvation or social collapse, with people trying to kill them to take their food, for example. Now, you could say these are extreme fears breaking through unconsciousness when you're asleep. However, they're only at the extreme end. They're not crazy. So people who are feeling these things and thinking these things are tapping into those extreme fears, and they're not completely without reality, because there are places in the world today where this is a reality, where if you've got enough and your neighbors have not got enough, they may not take care of you. They may try to hurt you to take what you've got, because what happens is people try to survive. So don't dismiss these things as extreme craziness. They're really not. There's a difference in age group. Now, this is not the definitive statistics, but I think this is an interesting piece of research. But we only have figures. We don't have narratives to go with it. But I always think it's interesting to show you a few figures. I'm going to talk for another 5 minutes and give you a few numbers, and then I'm going to stop talking. So start coming up with questions or comments or feedback. So this was the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. And the reason I'm interested in this is because of the age range. I'm going to talk to you in a minute about some research and figures from the younger age group, but this covered all age groups. And they found the highest figure was in the 16 to 24-year-old group. 61% were very anxious and very concerned, felt that the climate crisis was having an impact on their mental health. And then 60% in the 25 to 34-year-old. But then look what happens. 44%, it goes right down in the middle, age 45 to 54. Now, we don't know why, because they weren't asking that question. You could think maybe midlife, you're struggling to put food on the table, you've got multiple pressures on you, of running businesses, maybe, of taking care of children, maybe taking care of aging relatives, maybe you're exhausted, you might be facing the menopause or depression or rage about getting older. There might be multiple social health demands on you, which means maybe you've not got the bandwidth, maybe you've not got the space to worry about climate change. I don't know. It might be interesting for you to go and ask friends about this. But then look what happens. It starts to go up again. And as you go to the over 65s, it's going up. I've been speaking with a lot of adults who are grandparents who say their children, the adult parents of the grandchildren, their children are less distressed, but the grandchildren are often very distressed. So it's something that I've heard in clinical practice as well. Greater concern in the younger age group and the older age group. Again, these are generalizations. Does not fit everybody. So just a few more minutes and I'll give you some statistics from the research that we did last year, and then I'm going to stop talking. So this was 10,000 children and young people that we surveyed in 10 different countries in the world. What we argued at the end of this was that climate change plus government inaction were chronic stressors, which had incremental impact on mental health of children and young people. And that unless governments act on this, they are failing to act on long-term mental health needs of their children. And that children and young people frequently felt betrayed and abandoned by adults. We didn't ask about other adults, we just talked about governments because we didn't have space to talk about all of them. With the groups of young people that I've spoken with, there can be anger towards parents, but often the anger is more directed to governments and people that they perceive as having more power than their direct parents. So this was 16 to 25-year-olds in Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, UK, US. We had to do this research quickly because we wanted to publish before COP last year, which meant in order to do it as quickly as we had to only select English-speaking countries. And so, apologies, we missed out a lot of the countries that we wanted to talk with, but trying to get the funding to do more. What we found is 8 out of 10 of this group felt that climate change was affecting the world, which includes the UK. And 45% reported overall a negative impact on daily functioning. Now, this daily functioning number is interesting. In the UK, this is lower. So this is the dark blue line. So here's all the countries. Have a look at the dark blue line. So you can see impact on daily functioning: eating, sleeping, going to school, having fun, studying, thinking about your future. The countries where it's worse: India, Philippines, Nigeria, Brazil. It's not confusing about why that is. These are the countries facing the immediacy of the impact. But I'm going to show you some other figures which show how children in the UK, the US, Finland are being impacted emotionally, even though it's a bit more distant physically. So this is an emotional response. Climate change makes me feel, across the word, 67% said sad, 67% said afraid. I'm not going to go through all these. You'll lose the will to live. But we didn't want to just ask them how they felt. We wanted to ask them what they thought, because it's the cognitive impact, thinking, that's also important. 8 out of 10, 83% worldwide. Now look, 80% UK. So the UK young people are thinking similarly to young people across the world who are facing the immediate impact, unless you're in the Philippines where it's far, far, far worse. 92% think people have failed to take care of the planet. 3/4 or more think the future is frightening. 75% worldwide, 73% UK. Do you see what I'm saying about you're not protected emotionally and cognitively by living in the UK if you're part of the group that is frightened about climate change? And of course, Philippines, 92%, because they're facing not just the awareness of it physically, but also the awareness psychologically. And this is one of the most shocking statistics. Over half think humanity is doomed. 56% worldwide, 51% UK. Nigeria, tiny bit more optimistic, 42. Philippines, 73. So we've got to ask ourselves, what are we doing to our demographic, to these young people around the world, that we're leaving them feeling this way and thinking these thoughts? And this is what is the biggest problem with this. And you may relate to this yourself. 48% worldwide and in the UK thought they were dismissed or ignored by other people when they tried to talk about climate change. Now, you may not be able to go out from this today and change the trajectory of climate change, but you can go out and do something about this. When people need to talk about climate change, we've got to listen to them. And we've got to challenge people who are dismissing and ignoring them. And that means challenging the media, challenging schools, challenging organizations and institutions that want to silence people when they talk about things that concern them. When we linked it to government action and inaction, 65% thought, this is the UK respondents, thought that governments were failing young people. Only 28% thought government can be trusted to be fair. I think that's probably an overestimate at the moment, given the state of UK politics. That's the only time I'm going to mention it, I promise you. This is a group of researchers that undertook this from around the world, from America, Finland, the UK, a group of psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, and Eloise Mail, who's an ecologist. So this is scary. Let me give you the good stuff and then we're going to stop. This is scary. This is distressing. However, I started getting emails from young people all over the world saying this kind of thing. This study makes me feel better. I no longer feel alone. I feel relieved. This is an important step for us to face this reality. I interviewed an 8-year-old for my research on Sunday, and I got an email from her mother yesterday saying, thank you so much for listening to her on Sunday. She is so, so happy that her voice is going in your research. The one thing we have to do is listen and validate people's feelings, because failing to do that is a form of moral injury. This is the human hurt that we're causing. And there's a group of 6 children and young people in Portugal. If you don't know the case, have a look online. It's a crowd-funded legal case. They are suing 33 European governments for failing to act on climate change in the European Court of Human Rights, saying that this is a violation of their human rights, saying that this is cruel, inhuman, degrading, or even torture. There are more and more and more court cases happening. So you may be sitting there thinking, well, this makes sense, but I don't like to feel depressed. I don't like these painful feelings. I understand that. But let me just convince you that feeling that loss, feeling that depression as part of this trajectory of transition, the grief helps us move to gradual acceptance. And this is radical acceptance. But we have to go and hit bottom in order to come out of it. We just don't want to get stuck there. You don't want to live there. You want to visit and move through it. This gives us radical acceptance, radical hope, and moving forwards. And why is this good? Well, you can see that moving forwards, you're at a higher level of functioning psychologically than when you went in. This is how we build resilience. This is how we build strong, resilient mental health. When we plant a seed in a plant pot, there has to be grit in the plant pot because the roots grow down and grow round the grit. And that gives the root resilience. If you plant a seed in a plant pot, you get plant pot number 1. The plant will grow, but it'll flop. It'll just collapse. It won't have any resilience to it. So we need grit, we need challenge, we need discomfort. This is an essential part of what it means to come to terms with the climate emergency. What you don't want is plant pot number 3, where the discomfort and the overwhelm and the exhaustion crushes you. So if you're trying to grow surrounded by rocks and boulders, get some people in to break these rocks down. So you need a balance. You need to deal with people's emotions, including your own. You need to deal with their thinking and practical physical action. Do not try and take physical action without also tackling cognition, thinking, and emotion. Pay attention. These are healthy defenses. Forgiveness, gratitude, humility, humor, kindness, mindfulness, patience, respect, self-talk, be compassionate, have courage, work on this emotional self-regulation. I've said all of that. And then we can reframe the anxiety and the distress to understanding, eco-empathy, eco-compassion, eco-courage, community, awareness. We are here now. Whatever your belief system, we have arrived here on this planet now, at this point in time. So we have to face that. We have to deal with that. This is the challenge we've been given. We might not like it. We might not want it. I sure as heck don't want it. But we have to accept this is our thing and stepping into it, embracing it, accepting this as part of what it means to be alive today gives us the possibility of a transformative relationship with this, of feeling connected, belonging, forming meaning out of this, feeling the care that we feel for ourselves and for others, and feeling the care from them. And this is what it means to be alive today. Because we're basically, the human condition means feeling anxiety, which goes to the territory of being a vulnerable human being. This is what it means. So it's better that we face it than try and avoid it. There we go. I'm going to stop sharing now. So, any thoughts, any observations, any questions?
We have some great questions in the chat. So, Sarah, if you want to pop up and ask your question, you're more than welcome to. I can also kind of read it out loud. But we can start just going through the questions that are in the chat.
Okay, so there's a question this one I've spotted. Is there a clear way to communicate with children? Tips for each age group. I'm interested in this. Everybody asks for this. I'm not putting you down. You're quite. It's a great question. Everybody asks for tips for each age group. I speak with children are not little adults. Children are their own strange, wonderful creatures. We have to communicate. I communicate with 4-year-olds in the same way as I communicate with 14-year-olds around this. I honestly do not change. I might change language to make the language clearer and simpler, but I do not speak to them and try and make it okay. And I'll tell you why. When I started this research years ago, I asked a lot of children, how do I talk to you about this without traumatizing you? And I'm going to tell you what Sophia said. I have to use her name. I'm in trouble if I don't. She was 8 at the time. I wish this girl was running the world, by the way. But anyway, she said, you've got to tell us the truth. Because if you don't tell us the truth, you're lying to us. She said, and if you lie to us, we don't trust you. And if we can't trust you, we can't tell you how we feel. And if we can't tell you how we feel, we're on our own. I love this girl. She said, but don't tell us all the bad news all at once. Tell us some bad news, then some good news, then some bad news, then some good news. This is what we do to talk to children. Listen to Sophia. And she finished by saying, anyway, she said, I'm not a baby. All right? Crucially, we need to talk to children, not just about the practical stuff, but also the emotional stuff. Show them how to deal with their feelings around this. It's not school's fault, but schools are having to teach this stuff in schools, but they don't deal with the emotional side of things. So I've done a lot of work with schools, giving children opportunities to tell stories about climate change, to imagine climate change. And children will then tell you anything and everything. They're online, they're educating themselves. So if we're not taking opportunities to talk to them and I would say on a weekly basis, normalize it. Yeah, don't just save it up once a month, have a big scary conversation. In the same way as you wouldn't dream, even with your 3-4-year-olds, you wouldn't dream of not talking to them about granny getting sick and dying, or their hamster dying, or mummy and mummy divorcing, or you wouldn't not talk to your 4-year-old about that, would you? Because your 4-year-old would think they were going mad, right? We know how to talk to 4-year-olds about difficult stuff. You use the same way of talking about those things as you would about climate change, because climate change is going to be part of that 4-year-old's life for the whole of their lives. So the more normal you can make it, the better. And crucially, use we language. We need to find a way through this. We as a family group, or we as a community, doesn't matter what your family group constitutes, we're in this together. A mother and daughter came to one of my talks a few years ago, and they'd fallen out over stuff. But on the way home, they talked about this, and they emailed me the next day. And what I always say to parents is, apologize to your children. And in fact, I apologize to children all the time. I say, I'm really sorry that my generation has messed up, and the generation before me has messed up, and I'm sorry. And now let's do something about this together. And this mum emailed me on the way home, and she said, we talked about it all the way home. And she said, I did. She said, I'm sorry, to her daughter. And her daughter said, all right, okay. She said, what are you going to do about it? Right? And mum said, what do you want me to do? And her daughter said, I want you to come into school, and I want you to lobby the school so I can change my extended project to do it on climate change. And they won't want to let me. And her mum said, yeah, of course I will. I'll do that. So she did. So ask children what they want from us. Ask how. My first question to a child would always be, how should we talk about this? What should we do about this? Because they'll tell you. And chances are they're already quite well informed, because they will, yes, amazing Sophia for world domination, completely. She's about 12 now, and she's still pretty smart. I used to turn up all the time to do research interviews with very young children. And the parents used to say things like saying, I don't think my child knows about climate change. Within minutes, they were telling me all about it. So they know quite a lot already. Ask them, just ask them. I'll send Denise a resource leaflet that I wrote about communicating with children about climate change, and she can send it on to you. So thoughts on how it's framed. We need people to care. So we need to make it clear about the severity. I quite agree. 10 years ago, I used to be a bit sweeter. Time is running out. I'm not so sweet today. Strong resistance, people talking about how bad it is. Yeah, they're protecting themselves, right? They need to come to terms with their own anxiety about climate change. And they will frame this and rationalize it as an argument about, oh, you mustn't traumatize people and you mustn't terrify children. This is bullshit, right? They don't want to be scared themselves. Yeah. So I would cut through that and I would say, yeah, I totally get it that you're scared. I understand that you're scared. I understand that you're resistant. But actually, the majority of people want us to tell the truth. We have no choice. It's important. Telling the truth doesn't demotivate people. You do have to show people how to navigate those difficult feelings. But if you contain those feelings, give people permission to feel them, use that curve, change curve, and say, it's okay to feel rage. It's okay to be depressed. It's okay to feel anxious. And then let's process it. If you show people how to navigate those emotions, it is motivating. How do I galvanize people who don't care? I use stories. That's the other thing I do, is I use stories and quotes from children around the world. So I tell them stories about the teenagers in the Maldives who said to me things like, and most of these stories are in my research, so you can use them. You can just quote me. Go on my website. There's a lot of them on my website. Children and teenagers in the Maldives who said, you know, we saw online people had a funeral for a glacier in Iceland. You know, this is lovely. But who's going to have a funeral for us? We're going to be underwater soon. So I use those narratives of young people who are facing the reality of the climate crisis. Another teenager in the Maldives said to me, climate change is like Thanos in the Avengers Endgame, whose ideology is to kill off half of life in the universe so the other half can thrive. But we're the half being killed off, right? You cannot listen to that and not be affected by it. These are children around the world knowing that they're facing the annihilation of their country, and the rest of the world sits back and does very little. So I use those kind of narratives because I think if you hear those narratives and continue to not care, you're either so shut down on your emotions, I'd leave you alone, actually, because it might be too traumatic to wake you up. Or, you know, I'd say, come back to me when you're ready to care, right? And meanwhile, just move on. Go and talk to other people. You can't force people, but, you know. So yeah, teenagers, 5-year-olds, I communicate in very similar ways. And with adults, as I'm doing here today, we've all got a 5-year-old inside us that is utterly terrified. We've all got a rebellious teenager that just, you know, is furious and feels abandoned and full of rage. So we can use that empathic understanding. Is that making sense? Is that making some sense? I'm sorry, this is very fast. Is there any other comments, questions, thoughts? Got a couple more minutes. My website is open access. Go and have a look, if I can remember it.
If no one else has a question, I'll ask one.
Yeah, go for it.
Or I love your
Google me. Go for it. Ask.
Thanks. Yeah, I loved your response to my first question, but I guess, you know, just to kind of make it super concrete, when we think about galvanizing action in people who do not care, I know that I've read in the past that people are sort of inspired if you say like, oh, well, you can, you know, help this one child, like, you know, the organization Save the Children, and they pair you with a specific child. Like, what is like the climate equivalent of that? Like, how do we make it so it's less abstract for people? Do you have thoughts on that? Or?
Well, it's interesting. I think both things are really invaluable because I think that one child does matter, actually. And I often talk about the bramble key melody. Let me put it in the chat. Have a look online at this little guy, the bramble key melody. It's a little rodent. And this was the first animal to go, you see what I do? I go to animals, I go to stories, because that gets around people's defenses, right? When people's defenses go up, stories get around the defense. So I talk about the bramble key melody, which was the first mammal to go extinct because of human-caused climate change. And I say, look at this little guy now. We can manage without him. He lived on this little island called a key off the coast of Australia, and we can live without him. Sure. In terms of biodiversity loss, it's not that bad for us. But where do we draw the line? Do we then say, oh, we can live without polar bears? Oh, we can live without giraffes? And then do we say, oh, we can manage without Bangladesh? We can manage without Nigeria. So I use that kind of storytelling narrative to say, we've already got billions of climate migrants. If we think it's bad now, it's going to get a lot worse. And humanity is at a crossroads, a turning point of needing to deal with this at a level of cultural, political, soul level, as well as practical. Otherwise, we're in deep trouble, right? A 10-year-old said to me, you know, he said, it's different. He said, you, meaning I, grew up thinking polar bears would be there forever, which I did. He said, now you have to recognize they're going. He said, I've grown up knowing they will go extinct. He said, you need to understand how that feels. So we are getting our children to live with this grief and loss. So I often use animals because it reduces people's defenses. And I do something called seed bombing. In the UK, we have this seed bombing where we put flower seeds into clay balls and throw them out of car windows and hope that they grow in the road verges, right? And you don't know if they will or they won't. It's a form of rewilding. So I seed bomb people's defenses. So somebody who's defended, you just say, well, let me tell you this story about the children in the Maldives. You drop it in, throw it over the wall, and you say, do you want a cup of tea? And you change the subject and move on. Do not let them respond. Do not let them reply to you. And you just drop it over the wall and move away. I was heckled at a live event a few years back, where what I was saying, which was gentler than this, was clearly so triggering to one person in the audience. This was a Guardian live event, which if you know the Guardian newspaper in the UK, everyone's very liberal and very nice. And I was heckled, which never happens, right? Oh, and this guy just shouted from the back, shut up, right? And everyone was like horrified, you know? And I said, no, I got this. I understand this. And I just replied to him and I just said, you know what? I said, I get it. We're all scared. I get it. We're all terrified. I understand. It's okay to be scared. And then moved on. And the whole audience kind of went, they kind of laughed and sighed. And I have a suspicion a few people cried. We need that empathic understanding about all of these responses. It's an emergent mental health crisis. So we're all kind of like Bambi on ice, really, to use a Disney thing. We're all over the place with this. So we need to have the wisdom to be learning about it. So don't get caught up in there is a single way to deal with this. So how I'll stop in 1 second. How do we stay grounded and have realistic hope? Well, radical hope. We may be going off a cliff, but we're going to go down fighting. All right. What else are we going to do? And the people I meet through this work, and like you here today, you're what give me hope, right? This connection, these communities, these conversations. So do this. Right. Time's up, isn't it?
That time is up. Thank you so much. This was an incredible session. I appreciate the time that you spent with us, but just since we're on the hour, thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a nice day. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. Bye.